Well, thanks very much for joining us, everybody. My name's Sean Kerr. I'm with a
Is it
company called
recording?
Sustainable. Oh, sorry, pal.
Sorry, Sean, on you go.
Yeah, no worries at all. So my name's Sean Kerr. I'm with a company called Sustainable Thinking Scotland, CIC. We are based at the Walled Garden at Keneal Estate in Bowness. And I'm here today to talk to you about biochar. So it's something we came across about 8 years ago now, and we've been sort of building up the research base and the sort of use base for how biochar can affect not only food growing, but also a number of random environmental parts of the Scotland's green sector. So what I'll do is I'll show you a few bits and bobs about how we started and how our journey got going with biochar, and then I'll talk about the actual utilisation and then how you can use it in your own gardens. There we go. So we were started in October 2016 with three real main themes. The idea was to first off grow food for the local food banks. We've got a little food bank farm that allows us to grow food and donate it straight to the local food banks. We also have a carbon capture project, which is not only our composting but also the biochar stuff that we're going to talk about today. And we've also got our community wellbeing side of stuff, which is where we run mental health and training workshops that allow people to come in and make use out of the farm and stuff that we've got. So we started back in October 2016 by getting a little bit of space here from the council at the Keneal Estate in Bowness. So the Keneal Estate is a 200-acre woodland that allows us to grow within the walled garden all the fruits and vegetables that we want. As you can see, there's quite a bit of growing space. Previously, it was used for the council's plant nursery to grow their own flowers for the roundabouts and the local community. We've since then taken over quite a bit of the space. When we first started, we only had this little red section here. We had one polytunnel and two open bits of land. And the only reason we really got it was because it was a bit of a dumping ground from when the council had started. So there was loads of pallet waste that was on the land, and the actual wall that you can see at the back had collapsed into one of our polytunnels. So we'd said, if we take the polytunnel and we redo it up, can we start growing vegetables for the local food banks? Council said yes, that's not a problem. And thankfully for us, we didn't have a lot of money at the time, so the stuff that we had, like the big raised beds, the big pallets and stuff like that, were actually really handy for us because it allowed us to get a sort of jump on growing as fast as we possibly can. So by the May, we basically turned the space into something that was capable of actually growing lots of fruit and vegetables. And Steve, my co-founder, had also been a little bit impatient and had started growing stuff in his house. So by the time we got to June 2017, we'd actually made our first food bank donation. So this is Steve making it a way back at the start. As you can see, it wasn't a lot of stuff that we were handing in at the very start. It was mostly things like salad leaves, rhubarb, few bits and bobs. The idea originally when we were doing year one was just to make sure that we could get the system in place so that the food banks were getting the food at the best nutritional value and for the longest shelf life possible. So Steve usually picks the food at about 8 o'clock in the morning. It's with the food bank for about 9 o'clock in the morning, and then it's in someone's fridge by 10 o'clock in the morning, which means that they're getting as much out of the food as they possibly can. So in year one, we managed to make 13 donations. Year two, we managed to make about 23. And as you can see, the volume of stuff managed to go up, and also the diversity of the things that we're growing. We've now got carrots, we've got kale, we've got tomatoes, we've got a few bits and bobs in there as well that would help sort of fill out a regular meal. But that was nice because that allowed us to sort of see what we could manage to get out of one polytunnel. When we got to year three, not only did we get a second polytunnel, but my co-founder Steve got the most beautiful little collie dog you'll ever lay your eyes on. That's Billy. So she basically looks after all the fruit and vegetables, looks after all the people and the animals that we've now got on site as well. She's also a little social media superstar because she's much prettier than me and Steve. So she's always the one that goes on Facebook for us. But then we got to year four, that was the year that COVID hit. So we actually said to the council, if you guys are going to be moving out or not using the polytunnels, can we take over the entire site? And we were allowed to. So that was us getting essentially seven large polytunnels and three bigger greenhouses. When we were dealing with people during the height of the COVID shielding, the people that we were dealing with at the food bank before that was about 18 families per week. But during the height of the shielding, it jumped up to about 80 families per week. So being able to grow at that sort of scale became difficult. I think if anybody's done composting, you'll know that it's just not quite quick enough unless you've got a really large scale system. It's not quite quick enough to be able to rejuvenate the beds that you need year on year, especially if you're growing to donate about 35 donations out the door every single year. But that sort of takes us to where the farm is just now. This is a little demonstration of all the beds that we've got. But essentially, we've got 160 raised beds over 7 polytunnels. We've now got chickens, bees, and Steve manages to grow about 3 or 4 tons worth of food every year and hands it out to 4 of the food banks that we work with. So that was really our catalyst for wanting to think about how we could start doing some rejuvenating of the raised beds and improving the soil health within them. Again, we'd started doing some composting, but it wasn't quite what we were needing. So we had to look around about the estate. And again, that's where we started to look at the 200 acres worth of woodlands that we've got around about us that would allow us to then start utilising the resources that come from it, especially the waste products. But one of the other reasons that we've got for trying to do all the sort of biochar stuff is that we want to generate revenue from this sort of innovative environmental work that we do so that we can fund the other side of the social stuff. So we've got the food bank farm, which is our main social project, but the other main social projects are our community wellbeing stuff. So I'm just going to quickly touch on them. Those can be the stuff that we do within the community. This is us out at the Salmon Court Care Home, renovating their back garden and putting in growing spaces. And similarly, this is us down at the Bowness Community Hospital, leading a team of volunteers to try and put a sensory garden in to try and help the new dementia ward that's down at the community hospital. But we also do stuff in local schools. So this was one of the projects that we've done where we went out to local schools and helped them develop their growing space, taught the kids how to grow their own vegetables, and then used that as a catalyst to help grow more stuff within Bowness, and then gave the kids the option of deciding where it went. So a couple of the schools donated it with our food bank donations and put it into the local food bank. Some of the other folk decided that they wanted to have a healthy tuck, and one of the other smaller schools decided they just wanted to make a big giant pot of soup for everybody so that they could take it all home at the end of the day. We also run sort of summer series of workshops where kids can come up during the summer holidays and learn things like practical skills around recycling, reuse, as well as how to harvest the donations and then hand them all into the food bank and stuff as well. The main thing that we do now in terms of our wellbeing stuff, it's all been consolidated into what's called the Pathways Programme. It basically gets run from our community hub that we've got up at the Walled Garden. So everything's completely off-grid. We have a solar power community hub that's got 6 log cabins that provide teaching, hot desking, meeting facilities for everything that we do. From there, that allows us to run our FDAM groups. This was our group that we had a couple of years back where they were doing our John Muir Awards, learning about ecosystems, planting, beekeeping and growing. They also actually were really successful. Not only did they do level 1 and level 2, but after completing level 3 of the John Muir Award, the group were actually selected to represent Scotland at the European Challenge. So a couple of them managed to get flown out to Amsterdam to go and explain everything they've been doing, the journey they've been on, and the benefits that it's caused them, not only in terms of mental health, but the connections socially that they've made with the rest of the people in the group. So for that one, that was a real big and worthwhile project that we've been doing over the last couple of years. We also run workshops with local ASN clusters. So this is the pathway that we've got. So if anybody's in the ASN primary school clusters, we've got a sets of workshops that they can do. They can then move forward if they go to places like Carring Grange, which is one of the secondary ASN schools down in Falkirk. They can then do at a more advanced level of courses. And then if people want to continue doing stuff through their adulthood, they can then go into the final phase of courses that we have, as well as some of the accredited training courses that we can offer, things like first aid, food hygiene, and then some of the university and college connections that we have as well. This is our most recent one. We've got work with the Education Board at Falkirk Council. So we have 2 offerings. We have one where we do a schools group on a Monday where they learn how to become little social entrepreneurs themselves. And we have another group on a Tuesday and a Thursday that we're teaching how to do rural skills. So learning how to do estates work, how to do horticulture stuff, as well as looking at things like small animal care and stuff as well to try and prepare them for a sort of career in the green sector in Scotland. We also run a lot of open days and workshops. As you can see, this is some of the stuff that we've got, where we've got Potato Day, we've got our summer social. We usually run these sort of once every 3 months. So if anybody wants to keep an eye on our social media, we've got a lot of stuff there. So if you'd like to come down and see any of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today, please feel free. It's all free to access. Because we work with people at the food bank, we want to make sure everything is as available and cost effective as possible. So we try and make all of our events free, all the activities are free, and you can come and get some food and stuff as well for free. But that's just a quick whistle-stop tour of the social stuff that we do and the sort of reasoning and foundation behind why we do this carbon capture stuff. So to talk a little bit more in depth about the biochar itself, the first thing we've got to talk about is its carbon capture potential. Biochar has numerous and diverse applications that it can be used for. For me, the first and most impactful one is actually the sequestration of waste. So being able to look at waste resources and turn them into something that's useful later down the line. So generally what we do is try and take in organic waste materials from around about either the Keneal estate or the Falkirk itself, and then we put them through one of our big pyrolysis devices. So the main products that we use here are mostly woody-based wastes. So that's things that come from the actual woodland around about the estate, but there is the opportunity to also do it from a variety of feedstocks. So the one that's on the right-hand side, that was me showing the King or new kiln. He came down a couple of years back to see our operation and see the work that we do. So essentially, the kiln at the bottom left can take wood chips, the kiln at the top can take wood logs, and the kiln on the right can take a mixture of pretty much everything, including some green waste that we can take in as well. Like I said, it can be made from a variety of feedstock sources, which is essentially just different types of biomass. So like I said, we've got fruits and vegetable waste, things like corn husks and things that come off like that. Any plant and other green wastes, even things like invasive species. We've had people that have been inquiring about making biochar out of rhododendron waste, which again, hopefully is a very clever idea of how you turn an invasive species into something you can actually utilise within your community growing system. Our main one, like I'd said, is mostly from wood and forestry arisings. And there's also some new types of kilns that are getting brought out, especially in Europe, that can deal with things like manure and slurries. Anything that's got a high moisture content can still be turned into biochar just by using a few different techniques to dry out the waste before it gets pyrolyzed. So essentially, we take in this wood waste, and by converting it to biochar, as it says at the top there, it actually stabilizes the carbon content within the wood and stops its release for over 1,000 years. So that's the half-life of biochar. It's going to outlast all of us. But the best way to do that is to try and make sure you're using the highest carbon content sources you possibly can. So again, we take in this sort of wood waste, we then chop it down and put it into our big pyrolysis kiln. Now, the pyrolysis kiln allows us to put in about half a tonne's worth of wood waste. You can see it sort of stacked around the cage there at the outside. Essentially, what we then do is we then start a small fire on the inside of that cage because there's an actual unit that's attached to the lid that allows us to put kindling in it. That gets us the temperature up to about 200 degrees. And once it gets to about 200 degrees, it releases all of the moisture from around about the wood itself. Once it gets beyond 200 degrees, it will start releasing all the combustible gases, things like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, and hydrogen. Those are then collected by the machine itself and then repumped back underneath the firebox, which then means that after about an hour or two of using some different energy to try and get the process up to speed, once it gets to about sort of 250 degrees, the process generally just runs itself. It uses its own fuel from the wood that you're turning into biochar to then do the actual biochar pyrolysis itself. Now, one key thing to make sure everybody understands is when you're converting stuff like this into biochar, you're not burning it at all. The actual wood that's going to be turned into biochar, rather than actually meeting a flame, is only baked back at 450 degrees. So you're not going to be burning anything. All you're doing is extracting all the combustible gases that you can use and then using them as the fuel. As you can see, this is one of our kilns. It's currently operating at about 650 degrees. You can see the giant red flame that's shooting out the top of it. That's us taking back the different gases that come out of it and then using that to burn to allow us to get the heat up to the temperatures that we need to. The output from that is the biochar itself. So for every ton of wood waste that I put through the kiln, it stops the release of about 3 tons of CO2 going into the atmosphere. And as you can see, most of the wood that went in came back out the exact same way that it went in. All you're really looking to do is to blast clear everything that's in the little xylenes of the wood. That'll allow you to try and get as much surface porosity into the biochar as you possibly can. And as much of the gases we can get extracted means that the biochar is as pure as possible. You obviously don't want any underburnt or reconstituted hydrocarbons binding back onto the biochar and then going back into the food system. So we do our best to try and make sure we blast clear all of the stuff that we can, and then we're left with just the pure black carbon. Just to try and highlight that a little bit further, as I'd said previously, the conversion does not burn the waste. It's instead baked and releases all the moisture, the gas, and the combustibles, leaving 95% of the carbon content completely intact. So when the king had actually came to visit us, we biochar some thistles and some roses, and as you can see, they're identical to the way that they went in. There is no physical distortion or damage that gets occurred to the actual thing. All you're doing is sequestering and storing all the carbon in the most stable way possible. The thing that we really look at in terms of this sort of carbon capture potential of biochar, which is its main first point, is that if we produced biochar at a community scale by taking in around about 3 tons of wood from the Falkirk area per week and processing it, that would actually stop the release of about 486 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, which is a fairly staggering amount because for us that's equivalent to 1% of our local economy's carbon footprint. And that's only from one tiny site in Bo'ness. For us, if you could replicate that up and down the country, it means that you could extend that to a much, much bigger scale. But essentially, 1% of our carbon footprint from Falkirk Council is the equivalent of driving from Land's End to John O'Groats 1,463 times. So again, there's quite a lot of work that can be done, and the sequestration potential is significant. For me, though, the carbon capture stuff with the biochar is only the tip of the iceberg. For me, the biochar's main potential is what you can actually do with it next. And that's the reason that we've spent a lot of time trying to research the utilization potential of biochar moving forward. So the first thing that we did was look at where biochar could be used in the environment. So for us, there was a few standout places, main one being agriculture, because obviously we wanted to use as much of the biochar in our own food growing systems as possible. We've also got composting, as biochar allows us to accelerate the composting process and hopefully get back some renewables as fast as we possibly can. We've got things like water quality and contamination removal. We've done a lot of specialised research on those ones, which I'll touch on a little bit further on. But those same principles can also be used in terms of things like gas filtration and direct CO2 capture, which allows us to not only filter different types of gases, but it also allows us to collect and secure CO2 for later use. One of the other ones that we have been doing a lot of research on recently is the biochar's potential in concrete. We've been working with Tillicoultry Quarries to be able to look at different research potential for biochar's use as a replacement for some of the products that go into the traditional concrete mix, hopefully making effectively a carbon conscious concrete product. So like I said, the first real part we've looked at is using biochar in agriculture because biochar has been shown to improve key soil parameters. Now this is things like soil aeration, a really fancy word called its cation exchange capacity. Now the cation exchange capacity is just a fancy way of saying the soil's ability to transfer nutrients between itself and other organic materials within the soil. So when your plant is in the soil, it's actually extracting those key nutrients from the soil itself, and it has to have a certain cation exchange capacity to allow it to do that. By adding biochar in, it significantly increases your cation exchange capacity and means that the soil has a better transfer rate between the plants and the actual soil itself. The good thing about that is it will lead to more vigorous and robust and bountiful plants. We've seen a massive uptick in the amount of stuff that we use when we've got it in our raised beds for the food bank farm. But again, if anybody wants to come and see it, we're more than happy to show you around there. But we've also got our pure biochar range that's available from our website and our shop. We've got ones on eBay, we've got Amazon, we've got our online systems as well. So if anybody's interested in that, there's some more information on there as well as some videos about what we do with it. One of the other big key things that you can do in agriculture, which we're still in the middle of researching just now, is that biochar can actually be used with livestock really significantly to help not only the farmer, but the animals themselves, as well as the actual waste recovery system that's around about things like that. So one of the parts of the research that we'd read is that you can feed the biochar to livestock. And the first thing that that will do is it will increase the nutrient uptake within the animal itself. It will act as almost like a filter, allowing it to lock on to more of the nutrients and put that nutrients back into the growth of the animal itself. So people that have used this biochar in a whole farm system have seen an increase of about 10 or 15% to the weight of the livestock as they're using it. The other good thing, especially if you're using it in things like cows, is the smell of the manure is usually a problematic thing, especially if you're working in dairy farms or if you're out in the fields. So once you feed this to the cows, it not only helps extract some of that decomposition stuff that's within the cow's gut lining, but also when they defecate, they're defecating the biochar within the manure already, and the biochar does a good job of stopping some of the smell that's going to be released. So whether you're doing this as a whole farm system, where we would suggest you feed it to the cows, you also put it along the floor of your dairy parlour, and then you put it into your silos, which allows you to sort of sequester more of the actual waste products before they get put back onto the soil. It not only benefits the community around about you, so because you're not spraying as much smelly organic waste on, but it's also a benefit because less of it's going to be running off because more of it's locked into the biochar. So you're not going to get that problematic runoff that feeds into the sort of wastewater system that we're going to be coming on to in a little bit of a second. Um, Again, it's something that we really want to do a lot more research on. We do feel that the potential for this sort of stuff goes far beyond where the research is currently. So the more people that we can get, hopefully within a Scottish context, would be really good to showcase this sort of stuff working on a full whole farm system. The next thing that we can use it for is for composting. As you can see on the picture in the bottom right, that is actually a piece of our biochar under an electron microscope. And that's where a lot of biochar's main key characteristics come from. The biochar is super microporous. If you've got a gram of biochar, it's got the same surface area as two full-size tennis courts. So that gives you lots of space to be able to lock in different nutrients or water or anything that you're looking for. When you're using it for the composting, there's two main things that you're looking to do there. Its microporosity provides natural aeration, which is really good because that's one of the problems that you get if you're actually doing composting, that everything gets too compacted and the air actually can't get through it. And one of the other benefits is that it provides a perfect breeding ground and a colonization spot for the composting bacteria that we use. Now, if anybody's done composting before, there's two different types of bacteria that you need to be able to get your compost to work correctly. There's one called mesophilic bacteria that really gets you from about sort of 30 degrees up to 60 degrees. And then once you get beyond 60 degrees, there's a thing called thermophilic bacteria, which does 90% of the actual breakdown for you and turning the sort of waste products back into usable soil. There's a technique that if you want to have a look online, it's called hot composting. Generally, it's where you get enough organic material at the right rate. So you're looking about 30 parts carbon to about 1 part nitrogen. And if you get the pile at about a metre cubed, then that gives you enough thermal mass to actually miss out the mesophilic bacteria and go straight to the thermophilic bacteria. Now, we've been using our biochar within our hot composting systems for the last couple of years now. And again, it's been super beneficial because the biochar allows a place for the thermophilic bacteria to colonize. Anytime you're adding additional water to your composting pile, you're not just flooding out all of the bacteria that you've spent so long trying to colonize. The biochar allows them to stay there, and it also gives them better access to the decomposition fluids when they're actually doing that. Steve, who's in charge of our food growing project, has actually managed to turn organic waste into usable compost within 3 months using this hot composting with biochar system. It also means that the biochar that you're putting back into the raised beds has also already been saturated in all of those fluids that come from your composting, which again makes them much more available when it comes to going back into your raised bed. So essentially, if you're doing that with the composting, what you're looking to do is charge the biochar with all the nutrients that you're going to need for the food growing for the next season. Now, whilst we were doing that, we obviously don't want to continually add in our own chemical fertilizers because then we're only adding and contributing to the problem of mining or fertilization requirements that you're going to get from around the world. And I think, as we all know, these are becoming a problematic thing to be able to access. So we want to be able to find them in places that are already problematic that need to be removed. Fortunately for us, we didn't have to look too far. When we were looking at eutrophication, which is essentially just a fancy word for nutrient pollution, we only had to look up to Linlithgow Loch. Now, Linlithgow Loch's failed its water quality audits from pretty much 2005 and has led to the closure of the loch from pretty much 2013 onwards. That blue-green algae, the green scum that you're seeing on the top of there, isn't actually an algae. It's a bacteria that starts on top of the actual water. It's called a cyanobacteria. It's not only toxic to pets, but it's also toxic to humans if ingested in enough quantity. So that's why it's led to the closure of the park, because it's such a significant risk that SEPA have to make sure that it's going to be checked properly. Now, the problem with these algal blooms is that they really are based off of their phosphorus content that's in the water. So there's Every time a farmer puts fertilizers on the land, generally 20% of those fertilizers will run off into the water table, and then from the water table, they'll find the closest body of water and then they'll saturate there. Once they're in that body of water, there is a chemical reaction that allows the nitrates to eventually release, but it usually takes about 5 or 10 years for that chemical reaction to occur. In terms of the phosphorus, there isn't a way for it to naturally leave the lake. All it does is bioaccumulate. So every time you've got an algal bloom, once it sediments and decays, all of that phosphorus that caused that bloom will just resediment at the bottom of the water body. And then next year, when you get that algal bloom, it will pop back up and use all of that phosphorus that it was generated again to allow it to reproduce and grow. So we wanted to try and solve something that would, or find a solution that would allow us to access those chemicals that are bound up in that water, recover them from the water source itself, and then allow us to reuse them. But this sort of agricultural pollution for us is only one side of the problematic wastewater system that we've got in Scotland just now. The other one is that we've been to the River Almond. There's a really great community action group called the River Almond Action Group, who were looking to try and get bathing status for the lagoons a little bit further down the river. The problem that they've got is that there is 70 wastewater outlet pipes coming off of various wastewater treatment centres. And as you'll know, the wastewater treatment centres are allowed to pump out what we're calling treated waste, which I will show you a picture of later on. But the more problematic thing is that once there's a flooding event or if there's an issue at the wastewater treatment centre itself, the picture there is of one of the overflow points, which means that the untreated waste that went into the wastewater treatment centre just gets pumped straight back out and into the river, which then causes numerous problems as you go further down the system, especially if you've got a sensitive water body that's going to react poorly to the addition of these sorts of chemicals or untreated waste. So what we decided to do was work with our academic partners, which is some absolutely great doctors up at the University of the Highlands and Islands, away up at the North Highland College in Thurso, a guy called Dr. Sabi and a guy called Dr. March. They helped us design a water quality biochar. So it's called AquaPure. Basically, we took the biochar and we activated it by altering some of its key characteristics for this specific use. So essentially, we've done some thermochemical changes to the biochar that allowed us to make sure that the pore sizes that you've seen in the picture previous to that the pores are the exact size for phosphorus molecules. We also then had to do a little bit of surface morphology changes to allow us to make sure that the polarity of the biochar was exactly what we're looking for. Now, the biochar is particularly negative when it's made. The phosphorus compounds that you're going to be looking to pick up in the water are also negative. So if anybody's remembering their basic chemistry, those two negatives won't allow us to actually join anything together. So what we had to do is essentially make positive pits all the way around the biochar and use that as sites that we could shoot the phosphorus molecules straight into the biochar and sequester them that way. So I've got a little video here of what we've been doing. So the research path that we had basically started with us going from interface, looking at the biochar, developing the activation processes, and then this third phase that I'm about to show you was the actual water trials that we did down at Scottish Water's Wastewater Development Centre in Bowness. So us, along with UHI, had went in for 6 weeks. And this video at the bottom shows us taking an effluent feed from their stuff, putting it into our own ICB, slowing the flow rate down, and then percolating the water through a bed of biochar up over the top of the system and then filtering it back into the wastewater development system. Now, as you can see, the bottle on the left that's got that disgusting brown chemical colour and all the particulates through it is the stuff that SEPA legally allows Scottish Water to dump into the rivers. So the stuff on the left is completely fine for Scottish Water to discharge. However, it's got almost 1 part per million in phosphorus in it already. So if you're going to be putting that in a sensitive water body like the River Almond or Linlithgow Loch, then you're only going to cause eutrophication issues at that level. As you can see with the stuff on the right, that's our post-biochar treatment. So it's crystal clear. It's not only removed all of the particulates, it's removed the chemical activators that are within the water, and it's also collected all of the phosphorus from that wastewater system. So that basically allowed us to do 2 3-week trials back to back, essentially recovering almost every bit of phosphorus we could until the biochar reached its saturation point, at which point we then switched the biochar out for the next load of 3-week biochar, and then it done the exact same thing again. So that would allow us to essentially take chemicals that are in a problematic space, charge them onto the biochar, and then we can remove that from the lake, not only clearing up the lake, but then using that charged biochar as a fertilizer back in agriculture. So in our case, that allows us to take waste products from the water bodies and then put them back into the STS food bank farm, so we can use those nutrients to grow more fresh fruit and vegetables for our local food banks. That's only the tip of the iceberg again, though, because when you're working in the sort of wastewater industry, there's multiple things that are within the wastewater streams. So by having this research that we've done at the Wastewater Development Centre, that basically shows us the sort of manoeuvres and techniques that we need to figure out to be able to not only collect phosphorus, but if we were looking to collect other things within the wastewater system. And these include things like pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, microplastics, heavy metals, narcotics, pesticides or chemical pollutants. We feel that there's a biochar that we can tailor for each of those things that will allow us to recover it from the wastewater system and hopefully improve the water body that we've got, as well as then using those resources for something else. The last thing we would want to do is bind them onto the biochar and then have nothing to do with them after that, because that would then become problematic. When you're doing this with a wastewater system, though, some of those things like the microplastics, the antibiotics, the heavy metals, the pesticides and stuff, you don't want them going back into a food growing system. So that's why we started to look at different opportunities about how we could use that biochar once it's been saturated with those types of pollutants. The next phase that we're looking at, we haven't actually done the actual research on this one yet. We had been speaking to a couple of companies that were interested in doing this, mostly universities. But essentially, if we were going to be doing the same with water and filtering the stuff that we can through that, you can do essentially the same with gas. It's just a slightly different process about how you can do it. The one thing that we were looking at originally was how we can help remove contaminants from chemical analysis machines. A special big device called a gas chromatography mass spectrometer. Essentially, what they do is they pass helium and other chemicals around that allow you to sort of test what the actual composition of that gas is. Now, when you're doing that, these instruments are really sensitive to things like oxygen, moisture, or hydrocarbons. So what you want to do is avoid having as many of them in the system as possible. And the way that you do that is by having these little carbon traps that allow the gas to get passed through there. It doesn't take out the thing that you're measuring, but it allows you to take out any of the sort of harmful contaminants that would then damage or distort the measurements that you're meant to be taking. One of the bigger ones that we were looking at as well is that universities spend a fortune on helium gas to allow them to run this process. Now, if you use the helium gas once through the mass spectrometer, traditionally that's the gas then completely used. You're not able to then reuse it because it's been contaminated with so much stuff. You need to then be able to get that back to sort of 4.5 or 5 grade helium to allow you to then use it back in the mass spectrometer. So we're working with some universities testing the idea of whether we could recycle some of the carrier gases and then repurify the helium so that it could then be reused within the system, which would hopefully allow us to reduce a lot of the cost and a lot of the waste in these sorts of systems that are based within universities. Similarly, if you're going to be able to collect different gases, you can collect one of the most potent gases that we're all looking to try and stop at the moment, which is obviously CO2 release. Now, biochar can be used from specific feedstocks to help activate and capture CO2 in exhaust systems. The research has shown that again that you can adjust the pore volume, the surface morphology, and the chemical attributes, and then engineer it so that it can capture carbon dioxide in high CO2 environments. One of the ones that you can see in the picture down in the bottom right there, Austria are probably the furthest advanced in this sort of space in terms of using biochar for CO2 sequestration. What they do is they put activated biochar into their road mix so that when they're adding it to their asphalt and laying new roads, that the actual road itself has the ability to absorb some of the CO2 or some of the combustibles that are coming from the exhaust systems of the cars that are using the road. That allows you to then store that into that sort of system where if you were essentially using the biochar like this to capture CO2, what you're making is charcoal effectively. You're using the biochar as a carbon mechanism to store these combustible and burnable gases. Whereas in the terms of the asphalt, they're essentially using it as a carbon sink. So they can take additional carbon from the road use, sequester it into the actual asphalt, and then leave it inside the road. There's a little process called calcium carbonate precipitation, which allows the biochar to convert the CO2 from a gaseous form into crystals on the biochar itself, which then locks it in permanently into the asphalt. As I was saying, with those sort of contaminants that you don't want and things like this sort of CO2, that then takes us on to the next project that we've been doing a lot of work with, which is actually using biochar in concrete. So biochar, especially in places like Germany, has been shown to you be able to use biochar in green concrete to make a lower or a net zero carbon footprint during production. Now, there's been pioneering research that allows you to show that you can go even beyond sort of a net zero position by putting enough biochar into the mix that makes it carbon negative. One of my favourite companies is a Swedish company called Soeta, who built the world's first carbon negative wall, where they put enough biochar into the concrete mix, not only to offset the actual production of the concrete mix itself, but also managed to offset the three steel girders that held the wall up. So if you've got the world's first carbon negative wall, if you figure that out three more times and figure out a carbon negative roof, you're essentially building carbon negative houses, which then means that for every house that you build, you're actually sequestering and sinking carbon into the buildings themselves, which is probably the best thing we can look at in terms of sort of large scale construction recovery of this sort of carbon market. We've been working particularly hard with Tillicountry quarries to see this actually work in practice. So we've done what's our trials on the new product that we're calling our carbon lock concrete. Essentially what we did is we took our pure biochar, mixed it in and replaced some of the sand and the dust mix that was in the actual concrete mix itself. As you can see, we've done a couple of different addition rates, but from the test that we've done, there is no negative structural or aesthetic impacts. The concrete functions and performs the same, and it also looks the same, because one of our worries was that if you're using it for, say, polished concrete, that the problem might be that the biochar is so light that it might rise to the top of the concrete mix and you'll be left with little black speckles all over the top. Fortunately, by washing some of the biochar out with the concrete water before you add it in, that allows it to get the sort of stability and structure that you need to be able to mix into the concrete mix very well. By doing so, it means that for every metre cubed of concrete that we manage to produce, depending on the addition rate, we can make a carbon offset of between 7.3 to 29.18 kilograms of CO2e per metre cubed created. The type of mix that we've been using traditionally was called a C1620 mix. It's typically used for kerbing. So the idea was, if any of you have seen some of the problems that RAAC concrete is having, particularly with things like Maddiston Primary School and stuff at the moment, we didn't want to try this in a really structurally required sort of concrete mix to start off with. We wanted to start off with a really low and impactful one and then work our way up as the research developed to allow us to sort of get a portfolio of concrete products that can be selected for different applications. We're now working with Falkirk Council's roads team to try and see if we can get this kerb logging used in a couple of the jobs that we've got. So we're working with a couple of great people like Aaron Moyson from the roads department that's helping us sort of develop this into an actual field trial, which we're really looking forward to hopefully in the next couple of months. It sort of gives you an overview of what biochar can do. And again, like I'd said, for me, the carbon capture is only the one side. It's these interconnected applications that we can do where we can take things like use it as a water quality remover to be able to improve the water quality of lakes and water bodies, remove contaminants and then use those contaminants back in agriculture, or remove contaminants we don't want and then put them back into construction. But this sort of wholesale idea of what you're looking for in terms of a circular economy means that the waste product that we start with when we've got the wood waste never becomes a waste product again. That's where we think this whole sustainable think in Scotland idea is to make sure that we've joined all the dots together to ensure that we're not just creating more waste products the further down the line that we go, that this waste recovery is recovering these and using them as utilisable resources later on down the line. So the last part I really want to talk about is how you would actually go about using the biochar in gardening. That's probably the most impactful thing. It's also the thing that SEPA have their head around the best at the moment. If you look online for some of the guidance for using biochar, you'll notice that it's very vague. There's not a lot of information either from SEPA or traditionally from places like the University of Edinburgh, which is home to the UK Biochar Research Centre. They've mostly been focusing on the carbon capture potential of biochar and then its use in agriculture without any of the additions that we've been talking about so far. So we've been very connected with SEPA to try and help them bring them through in this sort of academic journey that we've been going on with, again, some of the biggest and brightest universities in Scotland on how we can make sure that the biochar is understood in a Scottish context that would allow us to then develop it further and unlock some of the benefits that I've been talking about in terms of the water quality, in terms of the concrete use, and in terms of being able to charge and activate the biochar even for agricultural use. So when you're using biochar in gardening, there is one main golden rule. Never put pure biochar onto existing or established plants. If you're going to be using it, make sure you're not doing that. Like, don't just take a bag of the biochar and start sprinkling it over the plants that you've got already, because all that's going to do is kill all of the plants that you've got there. The biochar itself is so competitive within the soil that it will outcompete your plants all the time for the available nutrients and water that's there. To try and get around about that, you've then got to do a few clever things to make sure that the biochar is ready for application. So I've got three of them that I would like to sort of just go over for you. The first one is off-season use, which is handy because we're in November just now. So a lot of you people, if you're doing growing, you'll be getting to that tail end of your growing season and wondering what you do with not only the rest of the plants that are roots that you've still got in the raised beds, but potentially looking at doing things like green manuring or trying to recover some of the nutrients using different sort of organic techniques. So one of the ways that we do it is if it gets to the end of the growing season and we still have some plants that are in the actual raised beds, you can just simply use the biochar and that golden rule for your own benefit. You can sprinkle the biochar over the existing plants, use the biochar to sort of kill them off, and then all of the decomposition fluids from those plants will get locked into your biochar. You can then churn that biochar into the top layer of your soil, and then that will allow you to access all the decomposition fluids from the previous plants that you had in the previous growing year. The other thing that we can do is have a green manuring process. We like to do this quite a lot because it's one of the most organic and healthiest ways to try and get some more nutrients back into the soil. So what you would generally do is take a pack of the green manure. It's different things like mustard seeds and a few other bits and bobs, and you sprinkle them on. You grow them till they get to a certain stage, and then similarly, you sprinkle the biochar over the top of them. You use the biochar to kill them all. After a couple of weeks, you then churn that all back through your bed, and then that gives you available nutrients locked within that biochar. One of the other methods that'll allow you to sort of get it into your bed as fast as possible is using the co-compost and stuff. Like I'd said, a real good idea is to add the biochar to your compost pile because it not only provides all the benefits and accelerations that I was talking about for your composting, but more importantly, it allows it to soak up all of those decomposition fluids. So not only helps with the smell of your compost pile, but it also means that you're not going to have discharge running around from your pile that's going to be then flowing into other things, which again is the same sort of problem we were talking about when we're talking about farmers applying fertilizers. That runoff is where you're going to get problems within the groundwater systems and then into the water bodies that are around about you. So adding biochar to that composting not only increases the effectiveness, but it also increases the amount of resources you're getting out of it at the end of the year. Those are the two more natural ways of doing it. One of the more focused ways of sort of getting the biochar ready for use, and this is the fastest way. So if you got some biochar yesterday and you were trying to use it this week, the best way that I would recommend would be to charge the biochar using chemical feeds. So particularly what we like to use is a thing like organic seaweed, or Steve makes a lot of nettle tea out of the nettles that we've got growing around about the site. And essentially what you do is you put the biochar in an industrial or a porous sack. You then put it into one of these blue containers that we've got. And we fill that up with the right mix of nettle tea, seaweed, castings, or if it's even the nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium fertilizers that are getting added into it. Essentially, you put a little bit of air into it. So we've got little aerator stones that you can use, same sort of thing that you would get for ponds or anything like that. And you essentially use that air to pump the liquid feed into the center of the biochar. After a couple of days, the biochar itself will be saturated in the chemicals that you've, or the sort of nettles or the seaweed that you've put it in. You can then extract that, and then that biochar is ready to use because it will then be at a saturation point, and rather than continually taken in from the environment, it's ready to give those chemicals and the fertilizers back out to the plants that you're going to be using and growing later on. So those are the sort of three main methods for how you actually get your biochar ready to be used. The next point is really where you want to be using it. So for me, again, the biochar has the best results when it's used in what's called the rhizosphere, which is usually the top sort of 10 inches of your soil, essentially anywhere that you would see the roots growing for a plant. So it's the narrow region on the substrate that's influenced by this root section. So once you put the biochar into the soil, the good thing about the roots is if the roots manage to grow down into the biochar's layer, it'll then create little tap roots into the biochar itself. Now, the biochar can hold water and nutrients 5 times more than the soil can naturally, which that means that if the biochar is tapped into the root system itself, that if you say miss watering for one day, then you don't have to worry. It's not going to be as impactful. The root system still has access to water and nutrients that are still stored in the biochar. So again, for us, that's the best way to allow your plants to become more resilient, is because you don't have to constantly keep adding inputs in. The biochar is just better at doing the mechanisms the soil wants to do, but it allows them to do them at a much more increased rate. So like you can see from the diagram there, it helps increase soil enzyme activities, which is really useful if you're growing things like peas or beans that are nitrogen fixers, because that excess nitrogen that the soil microbes are making around about the root system of the peas and the beans then gets stored in the biochar and can be reused a lot faster. It also increases the soil carbon. And one of the underrated things is that it also creates microbial abundance and diversity. Like a lot of the problems that we're getting in our soils today is just that there's not enough biodiversity into it. We've basically ran them ragged, and using large-scale pesticides and fertilizers has stripped the soil of all of these microbes, which again do a lot better of a job than the actual fertilizers do. It's just that they're not as consistent. Whereas we feel if we can add biochar into these sorts of mixes, you can get that competitive rate where you can actually have a choice between using chemical fertilizers or using organic fertilizers and biochar to help increase microbial growth and then get more resilient and more robust plants. Like I said, for me, the typical recommendation is using the biochar in the top 6 inches of the soil. If I'm going to be using that in the raised beds that we've got at the food bank farm, I'll take the full top 6 inches of the soil out of the raised bed, put it into a couple of wheelbarrows. I'll then add the appropriate amount of biochar into the wheelbarrows, mix it all together, then put the whole lot back out onto the raised bed and then spread it all the way back out. That means that you've got a nice uniform amount of biochar throughout the soil mix, and it means that the plants, wherever you plant them, have basically got access to biochar no matter which way the roots grow. But that is essentially just a quick whistle-stop tour of what you can use biochar for. If anybody wants to get some more information about it, then feel free to ask me some questions in the next couple of minutes. If you want, you can also go onto our website or email us or go onto our social media, because we've got lots of videos about us using biochar and the actual techniques around about it, as well as some more of the research that we use. Like I'd said previously, we're also looking to try and take a lot of this into field trial stage. So if anybody is interested in looking at how pure biochar can help your setup, then please drop us a little line. We're looking for field trials, whether it be in our pure biochar with farmers or livestock or dairy farmers. We're also looking at scale-up trials for wastewater companies, and also looking at trying to do on-site remediation with farmers to be able to stop any of the runoff that they're going to have before the actual pollution becomes a problem within the wastewater system. And finally, we're going to be looking at doing some more carbon lock construction materials. So things like bricks, plaster, grout, insulation. So again, if anybody's interested in any of that, feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much for your time, everybody. Hope that was worthwhile.
Thank you, Sean. That was amazing. Really, really
Yeah, no,
informative. Wow. We did get
thanks.
some questions during it, so if you want to just go through them, Sean, I'll just turn my mic on.
Yeah,
If
perfect.
anyone's got any other questions, please just either like speak them or put them in the chat.
First one is, where do the carbon emissions calculations come from? A lot of that is from the UK Biochar Research Centre. They have been the leading centre in not only Scotland but the UK for how you sort of evaluate biochar's impactfulness. It's probably also the reason that things have been so slow in terms of adoption, is because a lot of these carbon calculations have to be done consistently. And it also means that you have to ensure that you've got full life cycle analysis for when you're doing this sort of stuff so that it's accurate and useful. Um, again, for me, the best place to go is the UK Biochar Research Centre, or if you go to ResearchGate and search for biochar, there's a lot of documents that will focus on the sort of carbon calculations that you've got there. In terms of our carbon calculations for how it would meet the 1% of our local authority's carbon footprint and then the sort of equivalency on that sort of stuff, that was actually done by the council's carbon team themselves. So we gave them the information that we had from the research we did with UHI, showing them the carbon content of the biochar itself and the sort of sequestration potential, as well as all the research that they already had from the UK Biochar Research Centre. And then they used that to then calculate how much the return rate would essentially be for each of the biochars if we were processing it at a certain rate. The next question was, can you give us some links to the research about benefits to growing and composting? Yeah, definitely can do. Again, for me, the best place to start there is the UK Biochar Research Centre. They have their own website, ukbrc, I think it is, .com, that will allow you to access a lot of the research that they've got. Alternatively, I would go to ResearchGate and search for a lot of the stuff that's out there. The problem that you're going to have when you're looking at that sort of stuff is that biochar isn't the same wherever you do it. There'll be a lot of research that you'll see in places like that are focused on China, which has a lot of different feedstock and biomass sources that are completely different from the ones that we traditionally use. So the data that you get might not be entirely transferable, but there are more and more companies in Scotland that are starting to use this sort of stuff, and there are more and more universities that are focusing research onto that. So another one that I would recommend would be anything to do with the University of the Highlands and Islands. They've got a lot of research in biochar's use. One of our other partners, which is the University of Strathclyde, we've actually got a PhD student that's been with us for the last 3 years. She's just finishing off her dissertation now, looking at biochar in terms of water capture and soil use. So again, there'll be lots of information that's there for it. But I can also pass a little sheet over to Morag, who can put it out to everybody. That's got a few more links to the research that we've got as well. I think the last one was just about getting the recording emailed across, which, yep, I'm pretty sure all of this is going to be recorded and sent out for everybody. So if anybody wants to have a check of it, have a look at the video, get in touch, feel free to do that after you've had a wee watch and I can talk to you more about it.
Great, thank you. I'll just turn off the recording now.